keeping the goals of the people that we serve and the voices of lived experience, I have the pleasure of introducing our first session this morning. So I am proud to introduce Choice, Voice, How Youth Voice, Autonomy, and Persistence Created a Leader. And we're honored to have Rowan Willis-Powell, RPS, who is president of the board of directors at Youth Move National. And I have had the pleasure of hearing Rowan speak before. It is amazing and hopeful and inspiring and exhilarating to hear her speak, to have the courage and share her story and the impact that she is now making on youth and opportunities in Nebraska, because I hear she's going to be helping us with TA. But she's very passionate advocate, and what a great way to start our conference to keep us grounded with a voice of lived experience and how we all can continue to raise up those voices. So, Rowan?
Good morning, everyone. Can we all hear me okay? Beautiful. Okay. As Brian and Sherry said, my name is Rowan Willis-Powell. I am so honored to be here with you today, especially in person. This is the first in-person meeting I've been to since March of 2020. So, a little interesting, very new. I'm thrilled to be able to open your annual meeting and to talk with you about my life. But I have to say, when Dr. Brian Hepburn originally asked me to do this, I was a little nervous. Brian has always been a big person in Maryland. When he reached out and told me that he wanted me to talk about what it's like to go from being a peer leader to a leader in the behavioral health field, I was a bit shocked and speechless at the idea that the Brian Hepburn thought that I was a leader. I think I called my mom first. For someone who used to be the head of Maryland's behavioral health system, who I've known since my first job in the field, to view me as a leader is a bit mind-blowing. After that set in, I realized that I would have to say NASMHPD without accidentally saying NASCAR. Obviously, I realized that I couldn't do that. So I just needed to work it in somewhere to get it over with. That was my mother's advice. Now that I've gotten that out of my system, let me give you a crash course introduction to who I am. I currently live in Hyattsville, Maryland with my fiance, Olivia, and our cat, Finn. I wear many hats as the president of the board of Youth Move National, as a new project coordinator at C4 Innovations, and until recently, the TAE program manager at Autonomy of Maryland. I've worked in this field for almost 10 years, and to my own surprise, I'm considered an expert in youth suicidality, youth engagement, and rural community engagement. My friends know me as the one who can't stop thinking and talking about work and loves to connect people to resources. I grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland, which for those of you who don't know, is a very rural part of our state with very limited access to resources. I was raised by my mother, who is a clinical social worker and an acupuncturist, and my stepfather, who is a natural resources officer. I lived on a small farm with goats, chickens, and a small army of cats and dogs. And I read so many books that my local librarians gave me a nickname and took to calling me that wild red-headed child. It was when I entered middle school that I really started to struggle with my mental health issues. And what we didn't realize at the time was some pretty severe undiagnosed ADHD. My mental health took a nosedive when I experienced 3 traumatic events in quick succession. These events truly changed who I am as a person and really impacted my ability to interact with my community, my family, and most importantly, ask for help. I went from being a straight A student that was hyper engaged in school to an incredibly anxious and depressed young person who could barely complete their homework without having a panic attack. School was one of my favorite places in the world, and my mental health issues ripped that away from me. This all came to a head when I had my first interaction with the crisis system, which I'll tell you more about later. These experiences were the beginning of the path that brought me to where I am today. My involvement with the crisis system is what led me to develop passion about the way that we receive services and engage with our behavioral health system, which has ultimately led me to the career that I landed in. You'll notice that I say landed. And that is ultimately because, like many of my peers, I did not realize that advocacy or peer support were things that could be a job. I thought the options available to me were social worker, psychiatrist, and psychologist. I had no idea that other avenues existed. It was really when I met my mentor and friend, Lauren Grimes, that I truly realized how vast our world of behavioral health is. I had started working at Midshore Behavioral Health Systems at the time, my local core service agency, as a youth engagement specialist. I was the youngest person on staff, which I was told frequently. I had just turned 19, which coincidentally was a requirement of me being hired. And I had no idea what peer support was or even how to run peer support groups. All I really knew was that my mother had made it clear to me after I returned home from my freshman year of college that I could stay home to address my worsening mental health. But I had to get a job, or as she called it, a meaningful daytime activity. I was incredibly lucky that I had a previous connection to Midshore Behavioral Health. I had interned there when I was 15. That, and a good knowledge base about our local behavioral health system, due to my own experiences, allowed me the knowledge and connections to acquire this job. About 4 months into the job, I met Lauren, who came to provide my small team, there were 3 of us, with technical assistance on how to recruit young people to attend our groups, and Lauren and I immediately hit it off. Lauren told me about the work she was doing as the TAE program coordinator at Autonomy of Maryland, and the projects that she was working on that elevated youth voice and connected young people to the decision makers in Maryland and nationally. And I was immediately hooked. I knew that this was what I wanted to do. I just had no idea how to use my lived experience to get me there. At this point, I was still new to the concept of peer, and I hadn't yet seen the impact. I'm gonna hiccup a lot, I apologize. I hadn't yet seen the impact that someone's story could have on our system or its policies. I had seen the way that a peer could ease someone's first or 30th steps into recovery, and I had seen the power that mutual experiences had in alleviating emotional pain. But policy and system change were foreign to me. As I'm sure you can tell, I did figure that out and have the chance to see our system reshaped by peer voice. I eventually went on to step into Lauren's role at Autonomy of Maryland after she was promoted, and I spent 5 years there doing exactly what I set out to do. Lauren lit a fire in me by showing me the possibilities and what advocacy could really do to impact our service system. But it was my own experiences that allowed me to push further, and dive deeper. It was my interactions with the crisis system that really started to push and motivate me. So let's talk about that. I told you earlier that I started to deal with intense bouts of depression and anxiety, but what I didn't share was what came with that was constant passive suicidal ideation. my ideation was ever present. It was my brain's answer to any problem I faced. I want you to imagine going through your day, and any negative emotion or experience you have causes your brain to hit that proverbial escape button. For me, it was constantly flashing red. The result of my traumatic experiences was that I was incapable of dealing with any additional level of stress, whether this be math homework, an uncomfortable interaction with my parents, or, I'm not exaggerating, even stubbing my toe. By the time I was 15, I was pretty used to this. It was constant, and I thought it was just how my brain handled stress. And I didn't realize that talking about it could open doors that I couldn't close by myself. It was when I turned 15 that I decided that I wanted to try medication for depression. And like many people, I started that conversation with my somatic healthcare provider, my pediatrician. I explained to her that I was feeling depressed and anxious, and as it goes, she asked if I was feeling suicidal. I told her yes, and tried to explain what those thoughts were and what they felt like, and I emphasized that I'd never had a plan and had no active thoughts or feelings of trying to kill myself. This doctor, whom I had always had a good rapport with and trusted, politely informed me that she had called the emergency room and that my mother and I needed to go there immediately. I was blindsided by this. Never in my mind did I consider that this would be even a possible outcome for this conversation. And from my work supporting other young people, I know that my experience is not unique. I know that I could tell you countless stories of young people speaking with a provider in the hopes of receiving insight or medication to help with their mental health illness and issues, and then being stunned when they're sent to the ER, and then being further stunned when they receive the bill that comes afterwards, either as a young adult or to their family. In hindsight, it is amazing to me how quickly that conversation turned from two people actively working together towards a common goal to a single person making a decision that would drastically impact the other. From there, I begged my mother not to take me to the ER. I sobbed the entire 30-minute drive to the emergency department. And I couldn't rationalize why this was the outcome of the conversation I'd had. I know now that I am incredibly lucky and privileged. If I had been anyone else, the next part of this story would be wildly different. At the emergency room, I continued to have the panic attack that started when I left the doctor's office. But by this point, I was so distressed that I had started to shut down. As an adult who's done a lot of therapy, I can recognize that I was disassociating. I was so out of sorts that when a nurse gave me a cup to do a urine sample, I forgot to use the cup. And so the nurse became convinced that I was on drugs. The staff of the ER were not at all sympathetic with the level of crisis that I was experiencing, nor did they seem super willing to try and engage with me. They almost seemed distrustful of me and were unwilling to hear my insistence that I had no intention of harming myself. They didn't see it as the truth. They were determined that at the very least I needed to stay for the next 72 hours. My mother, who was the only person who heard my consistent request to go home that day and seemed to understand that this was not the best case scenario for me, took things into her own hands, as she frequently does. And after multiple phone calls, she procured an emergency appointment at a local outpatient provider and convinced the ER staff that I would be safe at home. Now, as I'm sure a lot of us know, this was only an option because of the level of connection and privilege that I had in this moment. It was my mother's connections and credibility that allowed me to leave the hospital that day. Had I been anyone else, I would have likely stayed at the very least for that full 72 hours. This wildly changed my perception of our behavioral health system in both positive and negative ways. My mother hearing my voice and choosing to take steps to honor the choice that I was trying to make forever changed my life and ultimately brought me to where I am today. In that moment, she was acknowledging that even though I was only 15, I was an expert on myself, knew what I needed, and took the steps to advocate for my voice and my autonomy. Having the opportunity to have my choice respected at such a young age gave me the chance to truly understand the impact of it and start my recovery process with my own choice. From that experience, I learned how to be an advocate for myself when seeking services and how to advocate for others. Whether that's in the role of a peer and mentor, making sure that a young person and their family has information about all of the options available to them, or advocating for autonomy on higher levels during legislative session or writing academic papers published by the APA. Although this ordeal did start my passion for this work and help me develop those skills at an early age, I do wish it hadn't happened. As an adult who has a publication coming out about exactly this, how this type of negative reaction to disclosure of suicidal ideation impacts children, and did a lot of research about why this is so common, I do fully understand why my provider felt as if the only option was sending me to the emergency room that night. But knowing and understanding doesn't change the way that it impacted my life. This interaction further inspired an already healthy fear of hospitals, created a distrust for my somatic and behavioral health providers that I hadn't had before, and made it incredibly clear to me that I could not talk about my suicidal ideation without being prepared for a negative reaction. As young people now say, I was terrified and hyper-aware that a grippy socks vacation would likely happen if I were to ever speak about my suicidal ideation again with a provider. I'd love to tell you that I don't worry about this anymore, and that I fully trust that I'd be able to advocate for myself and have a provider that wouldn't consider hospitalization as the first option, but sadly that's not the case. Even with all of the work that I have done as an advocate, I know that talking about my suicidal ideation with a provider, even if I were to take the steps to explain that it's passive and that I don't have a plan, could send me right back to the place I was at the age of 15. Except this time, knowing the system and having a mother that's a social worker might not be able to extricate me from that place. I know this sounds pessimistic, but I consider myself to be a realist with, I think like all of us, a healthy dash of idealism thrown in there. I know the ins and outs of this system. I know its faults, I know its strengths, and I know its secret cheat codes. And because of that, I know it can grow and evolve. I know that we can reach a place where hospitals are not our default and not our dumping ground, and all providers feel supported and safe when supporting their clients. But that takes really messy and hard work. And this is the work that I thrive in. That's what being an advocate really is. Being someone whose passion and voice shows them the light at the end of the tunnel. And that means thriving when the work is formidable. So how do we get to that magical place where our system causes no harms and puts up no barriers? Collaboration. We get there by working together and by truly listening to the people with lived experience. I know that you've heard this before, probably from the amazing peer workers that are in your individual states. But I think there's a step or two further that we all need to go. Earlier, you heard me talk about how Brian wanted me to speak about how I went from being a peer leader to a leader. After Brian said that, I put a lot of thought in it and had a lot of conversations with folks. And I can confidently say, although I'm not 100% sure, I think part of the credit really goes to the partners that I've had the privilege of working with. And I think they are the ones that are modeling that step or two further that we have to go. So I want to tell you a story about how this worked in my life. It all started when I joined the board of directors at Youth Move, which, reflecting back, I think that day happened in this hotel. And I think I parked in the garage downstairs, so it was kind of interesting coming here. The executive director at the time, Johanna, asked me to attend a 2-day expert convening at SAMHSA. She knew about my experience with the crisis system and specifically about my experience with suicidal ideation. So Johanna, being the brilliant advocate and connector that she is, asked me to represent Youth Move at this convening and to talk about my experiences and use them to help inform the work that was being done to impact how providers do suicidality screening in pediatric settings. This was my jam. This opportunity was my first time in a room full of people that I called fancy adults. Yeah. I don't know how to tell you, but if 24-year-old Rowan were here, you would all be fancy adults. So congratulations. I distinctly remember how I felt incredibly intimidated and unsure of why my voice mattered in that space filled with PhDs and academics. I'll fully admit, I felt this way a little bit again when Brian reached out and asked me to do this. But it was in this space that I got to see the impact that an advocate can have on broad-reaching work. And 3 years later, I see the impact this single instance had on my life. I left that expert convening incredibly proud of myself and thinking that I had peaked in terms of achievements. If only I could see the future. I had no idea that there were partners in that room, like Brian, that saw the possibility for my advocacy and leadership to grow. About a year after this expert meeting, I received an email from one of those partners, Dr. Lisa Horowitz from the National Institute of Mental Health, telling me how impactful my story was for her. Lisa then asked me if I would be interested in writing a chapter for a publication that she was editing for Division 37 of the APA. This chapter would be entirely mine to design, and the focus would be entirely up to me, as long as it was about suicide prevention for children. Let me tell you, in my entire life, I never considered that I would be a published author, let alone a published academic author. My very fleeting desires of academia left once I left college to deal with my mental health issues. So the mere thought that someone could be so impacted by my story and my speaking that they would ask me to do this absolutely blew me away. So of course I said yes. And I ran with it. I brought in another young peer advocate and Dr. Julie Serrell out of Kentucky to co-write the paper with me. We interviewed young people across the country and wrote a chapter titled Disclosure of Youth Suicidality, Views from Lived Experience. We spoke about the impacts that negative disclosure experiences have on kids and how harmful hospitalization can be. And we share our own stories in this chapter. which it's very weird to have my story written in a publication. I'm currently waiting for my physical copy of this, and I am pretty confident that I'm driving my fiance up the wall with how frequently I am checking the mail. But the opportunity for leadership would have never happened if I hadn't had partners that saw a chance for true lived experience leadership outside of the normal avenues and then took it. Those partnerships are really what has given me the opportunity to become a leader. And I want to point out to you that every single one of you can be that partner for someone. In fact, you can be that partner right now. We all have an opportunity at this moment, and it's 988. 988 has the chance to reshape how our system functions and make it more equitable. It can take away the harshness and lack of choice that I experience with my doctor and in the ER. It can remove the connections and knowledge that is currently needed to navigate our system and to receive quality and equity and autonomy-focused care. But in order to do that, we really have to go all in. We need to ensure that 988 is what it was meant to be, a force for good that does not cause more harm. And in order for that to happen, we have to buy in at every local, state, and national level. And more importantly, we have to think about who is driving that work. We must listen to the folks that are actually going to use this service and could be potentially helped or harmed by it. This is an opportunity for the peer leaders to be elevated and to be the leaders in this work. I encourage all of you, when working on the rollout of 988 in your communities, to turn to those partners with lived experience, the ones that have utilized crisis services, and invite them in as leaders. Invite in your career advocates who have seen the evolution of our system, the equity-focused advocates who are working hard to ensure that everyone is touched by the system in the same positive way, and ensure that you have a seat at that table for young people. We all interact with the services differently, and it's necessary for all of these diverse experiences to be a part of these processes. I know that we all have high hopes for 988. And by collectively working on them as a team, we can ensure that is exactly what we want and, more importantly, need it to be. In that same vein, when you leave today and you think back to what I've said this morning, I hope that you think of these three things. How my mother's respect for my voice and autonomy not only changed my view of our behavioral health system, but also distilled this deep passion in me. How the partners that I've had the honor of working with, Brian included, gave me the opportunities to become a leader in this field. And how you can be that partner for another peer leader and maybe even a young person. I am so honored to have had the chance to speak with you all this morning. And I hope that some part of what I've said stays with you after you return home to your own states. I know the rest of this event is going to be filled with amazing speakers, and I am thrilled to have been invited to join all of you and share a little bit of my story, and of course, represent Maryland. I hope that you will have a great rest of your morning.